It feels very different ranking wide receivers in comparison to running backs, whereas wide receiver, it seems like you have the tier of number one, obviously, with Jamar Chase standing by himself. I mean, I don't need to talk about how good Chase has been. He's been the only thing carrying my own fantasy football team. Thank God I got lucky enough to get him in round one. Over the past month, you're looking at a player that has had a total of 60 targets. Yes, 60 freaking targets. But anyway, beyond that, typically a running back, like the guys 2 through 9 are all absolute studs, which I couldn't be more excited about. Here at wide receiver, it's not like they've been super consistent. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I would put it 2. He's already through the bye week. Plus, you're just in an elite level offense. Now, the issue with St. Brown is it's an offense that's running the ball over and over and over again. The passing volume isn't exactly there. You actually only have 2 games this season with double-digit targets. So, I don't view him better than any of the tier 2 running backs like Barkley, Bijan, for example. I'm going over to A.J. Brown. With A.J. Brown, you've had 3 games this season with 20 or more fantasy points. Obviously, with this past week, he absolutely crushes. You get the receiving touchdown, but it's also a spot where you had no Devonta Smith. We don't know Smith's availability going into the future. With Nico Collins, I would actually probably have him ahead of the other 2 receivers here in terms of points per game rest of season. Obviously, he comes through and finally we get another game with more than 50% of the snaps played in week 12. You get the 20 fantasy points. But again, the issue in what I'm taking into consideration big time with these rankings is, does the player have a week 14 bye? Because you only have 2 more weeks until the fantasy football playoffs. Weeks 13, 14, then the playoffs are here. So if the player has a week 14 bye, they're going to miss half the rest of the regular season. And then Justin Jefferson. I mean, with Jefferson, obviously he is, one of the more talented wide receivers that you have in the entire league, but you have 0 games with 25 or more fantasy points. You have 3 games over the past 3 weeks where he's averaging fewer than 10 points per game. So, you just haven't seen the elite level ceiling, and you've had a lowish floor. Going over to tier 3, we're going to be led off with Drake London. With London, we don't know the availability of Darnell Mooney in the short term. Sounded like the Mooney hamstring injury isn't going to be the most serious thing in the world, which is nice to hear. Going over to what we have with Puka Nacua, 3 weeks, you have 14, 9, and 13 targets. And really, these are the only 3 weeks that you've seen Puka playing a full slate of snaps. This past week, it was a really tough matchup against Philly where he gets there. He's averaging over 20 fantasy points per contest in that 3-week span. Since you've had Cooper Kupp returning, Kupp's also averaging about 20 points per game as well. Both wide receivers, locked and loaded wide receiver ones, no hesitation. Looking at Mike Evans, we got very lucky to actually hit our underdog pick yesterday. Y'all know our pick was higher than Mike Evans, 55.5 receiving yards. Luckily, we get there with the 68 receiving yards. He doesn't play a ton of snaps, though. I think you should expect him to expand his overall snap rate going into the future. And hopefully we can, for the first time ever, go back-to-back with underdog picks. We're going to be looking at Zay Flowers for fewer than 59.5 receiving yards in the game tonight. Obviously, if you ever wanted to check out any picks on Underdog, you can find that link in the description, comment section. Promo code FLOCK will get you a 50% deposit bonus. Plus, it's going to be getting you a free pick if you're a new user for tonight's game. That would be Justin Herbert, more than less than half a total yard. And it'll get you a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. Now, going over to our next receiver, we will be looking at CeeDee Lamb. With Lamb, this is now his 6th straight game with double-digit targets, closing in with Malik Neighbors for the most targets in the NFL on a per-game perspective. Obviously, the Dallas Cowboys score a considerable amount of points here this past week, but still, I'm not super excited about the Cowboys. I'm not super excited about this offense going into the future. I view Lamb as a wide receiver that should have a considerable amount of target volume just in a garbage offense. Going over to what we have with Tyreek. You've had back-to-back weeks here where the Dolphins have projected out to be one of the best offenses in the NFL, and they were over the past 2 weeks as well. But even with them coming through with their projections, he still only had 7 targets a game for Tyreek over the past 2 weeks, 6 receptions a game. A little over 50 receiving yards a game. And Tyreek, in every contest that you've had with Tua this season, you've seen 26 fantasy points, and we're counting games that Tua played in full. 12 fantasy points, 11.5 fantasy points, 19 fantasy points, and 9.8. So I don't know. I mean, it's a great offense. Freaking Jonnu Smith looks like he is the true wide receiver one in it, though. Going over to T. Higgins, I know this may seem pretty aggressive to rank Higgins here. Obviously, with Higgins, you always have a potential concern with, a random lower body injury popping up. But if you look at the games that T. Higgins has actually played, obviously his first week back from the injury, back in week 3, he only scores about 7 fantasy points, but that was his first week coming off the injury that held him out at the beginning of the season. Since then, you've had 12, 29, 14, 18, and 30 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Chargers. Joe Burrow, is looking like statistically, he's going to have the best season of his NFL career this year. Now, obviously, the Bengals record may say a different story, but this is a team that has a garbage defense that is forced to throw the ball over and over and over again. The volume is sky high. Going over to Garrett Wilson, you've had 2 pretty down weeks here against the Cardinals and Colts. But in reality, I would expect that if Rodgers is under center, you should expect Wilson to go back a little bit closer to what he was previously. I know we had people losing their minds with how low we were ranking Garrett Wilson after the 30-point bomb against the Houston Texans. And I do want to reiterate, I don't necessarily view anything changing here with the Jets. We know that all the target volume is going to be funneled only between 3 players. The only guys that touch the ball in this offense are Garrett Wilson, Avonte Adams, and Breece Hall. It's identical to what you have in Los Angeles with Kupp, Puka, Kyron. The only difference is this is a much worse offense. And it will be, even worse than it is now if Aaron Rodgers doesn't play after the bye. Terry McLaurin, I think you can make an argument to have him at the top of this tier. But again, I do want to reiterate with McLaurin, you are going to have to deal with the week 14 bye. So having him for 1 fewer game than the rest of these players, I do think you have to point out the concerns. Malik Neighbors will be our next option. With Neighbors, very similar to what you have with, say, CeeDee Lamb, where this is a receiver that's going to just see every single freaking target in his offense. But the issue is it's one of the worst offenses in the NFL, so it's very difficult to be excited about that. Obviously, you'd be more excited about Neighbors in a full PPR format than a non-PPR league, given the fact that the just reception volume can save you in that full PPR format. Going over and looking at George Pickens, this is a wide receiver that's been much better with Russell Wilson under center, where if you're looking at the games with Russ, we have seen 22, 11, 20, 17. And this past week, he only gives you 8.5 points. But with that being said, it was a snow game. You were a foot away from him having a pretty decent touchdown. And obviously that would have been a phenomenal game from him. So Pickens just has been kind of a must-start option with Russ. Courtland Sutton 100% has turned into a must-start option as well. Sutton looks like maybe a straight-up league winner. He's averaging about 10 targets a game over the past 5 weeks. Over the past 5 weeks, he's averaging well over 20 fantasy points per game as well. So Sutton's been phenomenal. Bo Nix has dramatically improved this offense. And every single week that Sutton continues to produce at this level, he will rise in these rankings. But again, I do want to reiterate, similar to Terry McLaurin, similar to Nico Collins, we maybe are going to be putting a slight little weight pushing them down the ranks because they have the week 14 bye. And you only have 1 more game till the fantasy football playoffs from them. DK Metcalf will be our next option. With Metcalf, we'll go with him back-to-back with Jackson Smith and Jigba. JSN over the past 3 weeks has looked like the alpha wide receiver one in Seattle. I have Metcalf on my team. Full transparency, I traded for him a couple weeks back. And if we're looking at DK Metcalf versus JSN, JSN's been the guy as of late. Obviously, Lockett's been phased out, but I don't know. I still am always one to maybe be a little bit hesitant and look at the larger sample before we just go through and crown the new wide receiver one. Obviously, if we get another week of Jackson Smith and Jigba leading this team in fantasy points, receptions, targets, receiving yards, we probably eventually have to make the flip. But JSN, we love this dude as a prospect, and finally, you are getting this breakout that you've looked for. Then going over to Davante Adams, again, you still have the same concerns with Adams as you would Wilson. It's a bad offense now, and it's going to be an even worse offense if they do decide to move on from Aaron Rodgers. I understand that Rodgers has been so much worse than what people are hoping in terms of him potentially turning the Jets into a Super Bowl contender. But still, it's a better offense with Rodgers than it is without. Going over to Ladd McConkey, this is a wide receiver that we are going to see in the game tonight. Right now, his underdog pick'ems at higher, lower, 66.5 receiving yards. I would be interested to know in the comment section if you are going to be going with the higher or lower there. But it's a great matchup. We don't need to talk about tonight too much, right? Going into the future, it's a spot where if you look at the opponents that the Chargers have, they're actually probably going to have to ask Justin Herbert to drop back a considerable amount. If you're looking at the target volume that you've had in Los Angeles, Ladd McConkey has been soaking up the vast majority of it. While Quentin Johnston's had a ton of fantasy points, Johnston's production has been primarily fueled off of unsustainable touchdown rates. Whereas actually, you could maybe assume that Ladd scores at a higher rate going into the future. Going over looking at Marvin Harrison Jr., super up and down wide receiver 2. I actually thought that this was a good matchup for him going up against the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, McBride looks to be the dominant alpha top option. Going over to Zay Flowers, also kind of a boom bust option here in Baltimore. You can make an argument, though, to have Flowers ahead of Harrison based off the offense being better. But again, Flowers, you'd have the week 14 bye that you have to be concerned with. And yes, I'm officially waving the white flag. We are officially ranking Juwan Jennings as the wide receiver 1 here in San Francisco. Another game where he leads the team in targets, at least among him and Deebo Samuel. And obviously, one thing that we need to be on the lookout for is the health of Brock Purdy. If Brock Purdy is truly 100% in week 13, you could look to move Jennings higher in these rankings. Jaden Reed, I'm freaking tired of this dude. Again, you've had one game all season with more than 6 targets. The injury to Romeo Doubs did suffer concussion this week, maybe gives Reed a few more snaps though, which could help. DeAndre Hopkins could definitely be helped out with a few more snaps as well in KC. I know we had people in the comment section tell me, oh, Mason, the reason Hopkins isn't playing snaps is because the trade conditions. And no, I think the reason Hopkins isn't playing the, amount of snaps that you would hope to see is the same thing that you had in Tennessee. It's this injury lingering on through the season. It's his age. It would be really nice to get Hopkins up to 70, 80% of the snaps in KC. I think you can move him up the rankings if that did happen. Looking at Devonta Smith, I really need him back in the Flock League. I'm really hoping he's back. But obviously, we didn't really have anything at practice last week. He got ruled out from the game pretty damn early. I think he got ruled out Thursday, maybe Friday. But I think you have to lower expectations. Looking at Deebo Samuel, like I said, I'm waving the white flag. I thought once Brandon Ayuk was injured, Deebo was going to come through, and Deebo was going to take a step forward in this offense, and he was going to be the wide receiver 1. I thought it was going to be a great offense. Well, now, not only has Deebo been severely disappointing, where the last time you had more than 7 targets was back in week 2, but you also don't have Brock Purdy at 100% health. So it is very difficult to get excited about Deebo Samuel at this time. Going over to Brian Thomas. With Thomas, I am making this ranking under the assumption that you have no Trevor Lawrence. If Lawrence does come back into this offense and revive it from being the worst offense in the NFL to a slightly below average offense or just a below average offense, then Brian Thomas would skyrocket because he is the last guy left standing here in Jacksonville. Darnell Mooney, obviously, we're going to have to monitor what we have with the hamstring with the practice reports this week. Darnell Mooney has been phenomenal, obviously, the last game that he had against Denver. You only have about 4.5 fantasy points, but that's because he left with the hamstring. But outside of that, I mean, Darnell Mooney, the 3 prior weeks have been giving you about 15 points per contest. Josh Downs, I know it seems like we're really low ranking Josh Downs here. And if you want to scream at me in the comment section that we should have him higher, you 100% can. Again, Anthony Richardson's going to limit the overall passing volume in this offense. Well, at the same time, this is a team that still has to go through the week 14 bye, so you have 1 fewer game played. And then looking at Amari Cooper, you can very easily yell at me that I maybe have Amari Cooper ranked too high. I mean, Amari's had 1 game with 20 or more fantasy points this season. That was back in week 3. Whereas you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points. So reality, Amari should probably be the tier below this, if not the very bottom of the tier below this. But for whatever reason, I still try to convince myself that this is the wide receiver one in Buffalo. Going over to Calvin Ridley, nothing's really changed here. Absolute garbage offense where he's going to have all the target volume. Jacoby Myers, I know obviously blows up. I mean, he's had a really strong season. I don't want to say a really strong season. He's had 2 games with more than 20 fantasy points this year. But the target volume has been really strong here for Myers in Las Vegas. You get the 15 targets this past week, and it was a really tough matchup against Denver. He gave you this type of production with. But again, especially now that you have Gardner Minshew out for the rest of the season, I'm going to be very low on this passing offense in general. And Brock Bowers very easily has an argument to be made to be the top target earner in this offense. Jerry Jeudy over the past month has been great, right? Where if you're looking at Jeudy, you've had 12, 14, 26, and 14 fantasy points. Obviously, with Jameis Winston coming in, he has provided a lot more passing volume here in Cleveland than what he had with Deshaun Watson. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. Now, with Jeudy, what I want you to do is similar to how everybody was screaming at me 2 weeks ago that we were too low on Cedric Tillman. You're going to be screaming at me that I'm too low on Jerry Jeudy. Same thing that we said with Tillman, I want you to look at with Jeudy. Look at the target distribution between Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, and Elijah Moore. They all see about the same amount of opportunities in this offense. Jerry Jeudy's the hot guy. Jerry Jeudy, I believe, is the most talented guy in this wide receiver room. Go read the comment section from 3 weeks ago. People were saying I was crazy to say we had a larger sample of Jerry Jeudy than we had with Tillman. But I want to also be realistic here. Tillman's still involved heavily. Elijah Moore is still involved heavily. David Njoku is still involved heavily. And this is still a bad offense. Going over to DJ Moore, absolute blow-up game against Minnesota. But this is a game that goes to overtime and you only have 7 targets for DJ Moore. Keenan Allen doubles him in targets. Well, yes, I mean, the receivers play extremely well for fantasy purposes here this week in Chicago. At the same time, you had more than 50 dropbacks for Caleb Williams. And any game where Caleb has more than 50 dropbacks, the receivers should perform. I really hope I'm too low with Jordan Addison in these rankings. Y'all know I went heavy, and I mean heavy, on Jordan Addison with our underdog drafts this year. My underdog drafts are going insane. They're freaking nuclear at this point. Could not be happier with how they are going. But with that being said, Jordan Addison has been very much boom bust. He is a kind of touchdown or bust. You look at the games with no touchdowns for Jordan Addison. You've had 4 points, 4 points, 9 points, 6 points, 6 points. So you're just looking at a touchdown or bust receiver. I actually started Jalen Waddle. It's not like it did anything for me, but we started Jalen Waddle this past week. Still lost. Impressive, but super boom bust. This is the first game we've had 10 fantasy points with since week 1. Khalil Shakir over the past few weeks has actually had a ton of target volume in Buffalo, where you had 12 targets against the Chiefs. You had 9 targets against the Colts. I mean, if you told me with Khalil Shakir, we're not going to see Dalton Kincaid or Keon Coleman for any time soon. Dalton Kincaid, Keon Coleman are going to miss the next month. Shakir would be way higher in these rankings. But the expectation for me, at least, is that you get Keon back in. Not only do you get Keon back into this offense, but at the same time, you get possibly Kincaid, and that takes targets away from what you should expect with Shakir. But I think that's all I have for you with this video. Again, I will be live streaming tonight. Really hope we get to see you then. And if you have not done so already, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you wanted to trail us with Zay Flowers for fewer than 59.5 receiving yards on Underdog this week, you can find that link in the description, comment section. Code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you're going to be getting a free Justin Herbert pick, more than less than half a total yard for the game tonight. And you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night as well. But thank you again. I really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.